We used to expect more of public officials. We used to expect leadership. And the art of leadership is taking a policy and building consensus for it.
Hi, Marianne Williamson here. Thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. I'm excited about our guest today, Congressman Ro Khanna from California's 17th Congressional District. I also want to mention the American flag that we have added to our background here. During the inauguration of President Biden, there were 400,000 flags that were planted on the mall in Washington, D.C. in commemoration of the 400,000 people that we have lost to COVID. This was one of those commemorative flags, and I'm honored to have it here with us. People were able to take them, and this is a way for all of us to remember something important. I also want to share why I personally like Congressman Khanna so much, in addition to the fact that he is someone whose progressive politics, his values, his wonderful performance as a congressman on the political stage is of great value, something that I respect and admire so much. In addition to that, when I myself was running for president, he was always so kind and so respectful. Not everybody was. Some people definitely were, but there was no doubt. Whenever I saw Congressman Khanna, who himself was a co-chair of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in 2020, his attitude, his genuine, open-hearted respect that he would show was something that was deeply meaningful and appreciated by me when I was running for president, and I deeply appreciate it now. He is congressman in the district in California where Facebook headquarters are, Silicon Valley. So he's right in the thick of it when it comes to the tech companies, and I think you'll find some of my conversation with him about that very interesting. He's also formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce, having been appointed by Obama in 2009. He was first elected to Congress in 2016. He doesn't accept PAC contributions in an effort to keep politics and special interest money separate. He's married, he's got 2 kids, he's a great guy. He's everything we sort of want a congressman to be. And we're very fortunate, and I'm very grateful that he sat down to talk with me today. Enjoy. Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm very grateful.
It's my honor. I hear great things from colleagues who've been on, so thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. You're one of my favorites. I've said this before. I think you probably know it. You're a great progressive congressperson, and I have a lot of things to ask you today. First of all, how does it feel? I know you Democrats had the House before, but you didn't have the Senate. You didn't have the White House. Is there a palpable difference in the air? Is there a greater feeling of excitement, or how does it feel?
Well, Marianne, first, I just want to say one of the reasons I admire you is your use of language. People talk about ideas and your boldness, but you're one of the most eloquent voices in public life, and I think that's probably because you wrote so much and read so much. So I appreciate that aspect of you.
Thank you.
It does feel different. First, there's a relief that you don't wake up every morning thinking, what cruelty is Trump going to inflict on the nation? There is a hope and a sense that we're going to finally do things to help working families and deal with racial inequity. But there's also a heavy sense of responsibility, a fear that are we going to let people down? Are we actually going to deliver, and an urgency? So I would say that there's a high sense of we've got to get moving and do things.
I think the good intentions come across. The sense of responsibility comes across. I'm not sure a sense of urgency is coming across quite the way we need it to. I know sometimes people will say, well, will you just give him a week? But that's a difficult thing to say to a woman who doesn't have enough food to give her child. And even though you're a great champion for that $2,000 payment, there are a lot of people, obviously, who wonder why it's not already in the mail. A lot of people who don't understand why the Republicans can make sure that Amy Coney Barrett becomes a Supreme Court justice in just a few days if they need that to happen. Why is it? There is a perception that Republicans know how to move quickly and the Democrats don't. Given that you have the power that you have, what are your feelings about this? And what do you say to all the people who are already suspecting that it's the same old in relation to the $2,000 payments that they desperately need in order to survive.
And that they were promised. That's how we won Georgia. Well, I share their frustration. I think it's fine if you want to try to get Republican support, but that should be a 2-day effort. Let's see, put the package out, see if the votes are there. But Susan Collins wasn't elected to make policy for the United States, and neither was Mitt Romney. We won the House, we won the Senate, we won the presidency. Let's go. Let's enact the agenda that people wanted. We can pass it in the House this week, and then we should pass it through the Senate, ideally by eliminating the filibuster. But if not, we should pass it through reconciliation and expand reconciliation. I mean, a $15 minimum wage could pass through reconciliation by, even under the Byrd rule, by having a tax penalty, just tax any corporation that doesn't pay $15. But if you don't want to do it that way, my question is, why are we being governed by Robert Byrd in 1985? I mean, it's not like he was Madison or Jefferson or some brilliant.
That's right. It was not in the Constitution.
It's not in the Constitution. He's just a random. He's a senator in 1985, and he comes up with this Byrd rule because he thinks that people are adding things that are hurting the deficit. So we're literally being governed, our modern generation, in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in 2020 by Reaganomics, Robert Byrd, Senate rule. And just as a matter of pride, don't you think as a generation we should write our own destiny instead of ceding what we can do to Robert Byrd and an obscure rule?
Well, let's deconstruct this. Let's talk about this. I want to get around to the issue of the $15 minimum wage, which you just mentioned as well. But when you're talking about the Byrd rule, you're talking about the issue of reconciliation. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what reconciliation is, don't understand what the filibuster is. Now, in terms of reconciliation, when the Republicans wanted to pass a 2017 $2 trillion tax cut, they had no problem using reconciliation. So when you talk about these techniques, which in this case would be the Democrats using reconciliation, the Democrats' willingness to get rid of the filibuster, which also was not created by Madison, which also was not in the Constitution, people ask, and I'm asking you, well, if the Democrats have the power, why aren't they using it? And who are we to look to? We know we can't blame Mitch McConnell, although we're still being told we can blame Mitch McConnell. What's going on here, Congressman? People really do want to know.
Well, the excuse that's given is that there are 51 senators and we don't have 51 votes on our side. There are a number of senators who are opposed to getting rid of the filibuster. And presumably they may be opposed to expanding the power of reconciliation. The reconciliation was in 1974. There was an act passed that said if you want to do something for the budget, you can have 51 votes. People were adding a lot to it. And then Byrd came up in 1985 and said, no, we can only do basically deficit cutting things or tax cuts, as the Republicans did in reconciliation. But here's where I think leadership matters. You can't just say, well, there are a couple senators who are on the fence. Let's not go until we get consensus. If Lyndon Johnson had that attitude, he would have been 10 Senate votes short of the Civil Rights Act. You would never have had most of the New Deal pass if FDR took that attitude. What is leadership if you're waiting for majorities to emerge? Leadership is when you don't know if you have the majority, using persuasion, using the bully pulpit, making people cast tough votes to get to where you want to go. And so my view is keep having these senators vote on popular policies, $15 minimum wage, on $2,000 checks, on infrastructure, and then have them vote down reconciliation or a filibuster so the American people clearly know who's standing in the way. And I think if you did that, senators would quickly change their tune.
To the American people, and I appreciate that you're answering my questions. You're answering it fully, and it involves a lot of procedural issues. But to the American people who are hungry, to the American people who are desperate, a bunch of procedural issues does not mean a lot and only increases their frustration. I want to read you a couple. I know you're on social media. I see you on Twitter. I'm sure you see these things yourself. Just a couple of tweets that I saw that to me so name the moment. One says, anyone know how to survive losing your job, your health care, and your home in the middle of a deadly pandemic? Asking for several million Americans. The other one that I thought was interesting says, one thing I can't stop thinking about is how the pandemic could have been a chance to reimagine so much. education, housing, tech, but instead, powerful people crushed us to keep things the same at all costs. So I know when Congresswoman Jayapal was on the podcast, she said that she wouldn't have even wanted a Medicare for all vote quite yet because she felt that we're not there, and so just an up and down vote would not even be what she would want, and that, of course, she authored that bill. But I don't want to leave the subject of this $2,000 yet because you yourself tweet about it quite a bit. Why can't you just do it? I understand the things that you were saying, and I understand the polite things that you were saying about how you think leadership should be different. Could you please tell us the people who, if they behaved differently, could make this happen more quickly?
Well, the two senators from Public Reports were not willing to get rid of the filibuster, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. If we had those two votes, we would be able to get rid of the filibuster, and then we'd be able to move. The second thing is there's still this sense of, well, we want bipartisanship, and those of us who are looking at this are saying, okay, fine, if you want bipartisanship, but it shouldn't take Susan Collins and Mitt Romney weeks and weeks and weeks of deliberation to decide. Yes, they should support minimum wage. They should support $2,000 checks. They should support the child allowance, which would cut child poverty in half, because these are broadly popular policies. But if they don't want to act, then we need to act. So I think there is a genuine debate among Democrats about how much people want bipartisanship. My view is you don't have bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake. I had bipartisanship with Matt Gaetz to try to end the war in Yemen that led to the War Powers Resolution passing the House and an outcome of reducing violence. You pursue bipartisanship when it has concrete outcomes, not for cosmetic dressing of claiming unity.
Well, you're the one wearing the purple tie. There's a lot of purple tie. There's a lot of purple dress. I get it. We get it. Maybe you should have on a blue tie. This is just really, at this point, one thing about the Republicans, Congressman, if they win, they see the election as a mandate and they use their power. We also know that it's not beneath them to abuse their power at times. But the Democrats are seen, and I'm sure you know this, as not even willing sometimes to use the power that you were given. I know a lot of people have talked about the fact that the Democrats have 2 years to prove to the American people that the Democrats really offer a compellingly different future than do the Republicans, and that if that proof is not demonstrated, then they are likely, you are likely, we are likely to lose the House, possibly the Senate, and possibly even worse in 2024. I have said several times, and I think we have less than 2 years. I think we have 100 days. But I'll tell you something, with how this week is unfolding, I would hope that your colleagues, and I'm not saying you and your colleagues, because I know you have that sense of urgency. That's clear from the things you say. But I hope that your colleagues would begin to realize that what's happening this week, what's happening next week, what's happening right now to a hungry person makes all the difference. The second thing I'd like to ask you about is the $15 an hour minimum wage, where this is another issue where people are, the temptation to cynicism comes when, the people don't doubt that the Democrats say the right things, Congressman. That's not a doubt. We went through 8 years of a Democratic president who never didn't say the right things. People are smart now. So when they hear the president say things like, we're going to have a $15 an hour minimum wage in the next sentence by 2025. Can you explain that to us?
Well, it doesn't need to be by 2025. The argument for by 2025 was that it would have the least impact on jobs. But the modern economic studies actually show that the minimum wage to up to $15 has no effect on reducing jobs. What it actually does is it has people hire more people with a high school degree, but 90% of Americans have a high school degree. So it has a positive effect because you're putting more money in the pockets of people who are spending it, and that money actually creates jobs. So I understand if there were difficult trade-offs because of economics. I'm one who believes in economics. And if we were talking about it, even a higher minimum wage at some point, you raise it enough, it does have a jobs impact. But at $15, all the studies show it doesn't. And there's no reason to delay it other than politics.
So let me ask you, and I know that you can't speak for the president, But what the hell? Why is he doing this? Why is it not, one of the things that we've heard quite a bit already, just in the last 6 days, he is consulting with medical personnel. We're happy about that. He's consulting with scientists. We're happy about that. But when I hear politicians say they're consulting with economists, I get a little nervous because they're economists and there are economists. So who are the economists that he's consulting with that argue that we have to wait till 2025, given the fact that if people aren't helped right now? Congressman, I can't tell you how deeply I feel. If you think you had a catastrophe in 2016 because of tens of millions of desperate people, that's nothing compared to the calamity that lies ahead if we don't get this right and get it right quickly. When you say this, and I know that you do understand, but you were co-chairman of Bernie Sanders' campaign. You get this. When you say this to your colleagues, when you say this to the people who are the highest levels of Democratic leadership, may I ask you, what do they say in response to this?
Well, they say, Ro, you represent a progressive district and you were for a progressive candidate, but how are you going to get the votes? How are you going to convince the moderate House members, the blue dog part of the caucus, to get the votes to pass these bills? I mean, that's what they say. And I guess my view is that there are three, broadly speaking, forms of Democratic leadership. There are those Democratic leaders, and by Democrat I mean broadly, not Democratic Party. There are those leaders elected officials who think their job is to find consensus. There are those who think their job is to impose what they want, like Donald Trump. But then I think that the best leaders view their role as building consensus. And that's, I think, what the Democratic Party doesn't do enough about. We look at the caucus, we take a poll, and we say, well, we don't have the votes, so let's find the lowest common denominator of what to do. Well, you could have anyone in the phone book do that, and maybe people will think picking congressmen people out of the phone book is better. But we used to expect more of public officials. We used to expect leadership. And the art of leadership is taking a policy and building consensus for it. That's what Bernie Sanders did with Medicare for All. Before he talked about it, it was considered a fringe issue. Joe Biden candidly did that on gay marriage. I mean, he came out early for that. And so I think this is a moment that requires building consensus.
I couldn't agree with you more. Can you tell me which kind of those two leaders Nancy Pelosi is?
Nancy Pelosi has done both at times in her career. I think she built consensus on the Affordable Care Act, which we should have had the public option. But if you remember, there were
she tried on that. I remember her trying that.
And so I think she showed. Now, what I hope is this is the moment for her to use that and answer the nation at a time of desperation. I mean, that's what great political leadership is. The person whose tweet you read I thought it was beautiful. I mean, just saying, look, this is a time of crisis. Crisis can help us reimagine a more just society. And people, I think they see that we're not reimagining a more just society. We have my district in Silicon Valley. They're doing great. And, there's almost a guilt. You talk to them, they say, well, what can we do? It's a digitized future. Things are being digitized. The S&P. Do you know, Marianne, that the S&P 500 over the last 5 years, 90% of those gains have been FANG, the big tech companies. 90% of the gains have been tech. And so you have this extraordinary wealth creation going on, and then other people don't have access to the internet. Other people can't afford to eat. If other people can't have housing. If you permit, because one of my favorite economists, Amartya Sen, he's a Nobel laureate, and he said, in most developing countries, it's a very difficult choice because you have to choose between investing in education and investing in healthcare or having economic development. The amazing thing with the United States is we don't have to make that choice. We actually have so much wealth generation that we could have political justice without the difficult choices that developing nations face. We just are unwilling to do it. And that's, I think, what people find so frustrating in such an affluent society where you could have political justice. We're deliberately choosing not to have it.
I couldn't agree with you more. You mentioned people in your district, Silicon Valley. You've got Facebook headquarters. You've got Twitter headquarters. Can we talk for a moment about what's going on with the big tech companies? First of all, did you support the ban of Donald Trump on a permanent basis from Twitter?
I did, and I'll tell you why. I usually am all for speech, and I have debated people who are conservative disagree with me. But incitement of violence, which is what Trump has done repeatedly, is not protected speech. And this is one of the things I think the Valley has gotten wrong. Their view of speech is just they have this naive view that, okay, let's just open up a platform and have everyone say everything, and somehow exposing people to multiculturalism online where you can say anything would lead to peace and harmony. And one thinks, really? Is it that simple? No. We've spent hundreds of years thinking about how do you construct forums where you actually have meaningful exchanges and what type of speech is out of bounds and what type of speech is allowed. And none of those rules really have been enforced until now. You're finally starting to see it, but even then it's inadequate.
Well, people on the far left as well as on the far right are having a problem with some of these bans. I agree with you. I agree when Sacha Baron Cohen said that if Hitler were alive today, he would be taking out 30-second ads on Facebook. Did you talk to Mark Zuckerberg about this a long time ago? As his congressman, did you have conversations with him about the profound toxicity that was brewing on Facebook?
I've had conversations with Sheryl Sandberg, and I've met Mark once or twice, but it's really Sheryl who engages on these things. And I've certainly had conversations with Jack Dorsey and others, and I've let them know my view, which is you shouldn't have billionaire technologists making decisions about speech. What you should do is actually one of the things our country has done quite well is develop a very thoughtful First Amendment jurisprudence. It's very detailed, and it's actually a fair amount of consensus on the court about that. What we should be doing is looking to that in international human rights law, which has been developed by a person, David Kay, appointed by the UN, which is quite consistent with the First Amendment, and actually having a framework based on that and constructing public forums. But the biggest problem, Marianne, with these social media platforms is that they maximize for attention and they maximize for data collection, and that's because of an abdication of Congress. We have allowed them to collect people's data without consent. We have allowed them to become dominant platforms without antitrust violations. We've allowed them to do things without consumer protection safety. If we had those rules, you could imagine alternative social media emerging that wouldn't just be about maximizing attention, that would try to create more thoughtful forums. So I blame the tech companies, but I blame the abdication of Congress. I mean, we have done almost nothing to regulate these platforms.
So let's go deeper into that, because most people have seen Social Dilemma by now. Most people do understand the dangers here. My first question to you, is Congress going to act on this, do you think?
We must. The first thing we could do, I know it sounds technical, but if you had opt-in consent, in other words, if you had to give your consent before data, it would alleviate a fair amount of problems. Why? One of the reasons that we have seen the growth of QAnon online, one of the reasons we've seen the growth of these extremist groups is that Facebook, YouTube, Twitter are actively targeting people based on their profile, based on data they're collecting without consent, and basically recommending to them to join extremist groups, recommending sensational content. You would significantly decrease their ability to get data if you had opt-in consent. Their second thing I would do is have stronger antitrust provisions so that you had competitors emerge. Maybe some would use a subscription model. You know, we have such an impoverished vision of social media. It would be like if only thing you could see on TV was junk television, and everyone was fine with that. And no one was saying, well, let's have something more thoughtful. You know, let's have the equivalent of Oprah's book club on social media. My view is if you actually had antitrust enforcement, you would see social media platforms emerge where people hunger for a more authentic human connection. They haven't been allowed to emerge because of the dominance of a few players.
Well, you just mentioned a major factor, and that is antitrust. Somewhere along the line, Democrats as well as Republicans just stopped prosecuting the antitrust, Sherman antitrust. It's like it went away. Would you like to see, I mean, I know this is difficult for you. You're a congressman from there. Shouldn't Facebook be broken up? Shouldn't these things not even exist the way they do?
Well, I've said that. Do I think that these tech companies have created things that have also been good? Yes. I mean, I'm balanced on it. Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, Arab Spring. I mean, there's a lot to celebrate in social media being proper. But I saw no justification for them acquiring WhatsApp, for them acquiring Instagram. The main reason
Absolutely.
it's diminishing the choice. I mean, we could have seen Instagram before it became Instagram was actually a place where people would just put up artwork and put up things of interest. And it wasn't something that everyone needed to have likes and shares. I mean, we've created a commodity culture. It's like we magnified what the worst part of being in junior high was now every day. And that's
So
not,
true.
it doesn't have to be that way. Why can't Instagram just be a place where someone who's a little bit more quiet and artistic and thoughtful puts up her or his posts and shares it with a couple friends and doesn't have to compete for the maximum likes and the maximum broadcast. So we've turned these platforms into things that aren't appealing to the most authentic and highest human aspirations. And that's very intentional. And similarly, you could have intentionality, do things that were more thoughtful, and more higher calling, and that's what we ought to do. And I wish the tech folks actually just had a little bit more humility. And when the printing press came out, people would say my guess is there's not a person in America today who doesn't think that the printing press was a great invention. But when it came out, it actually led to a lot of wars. It led to people reacting to works in ways that were very, very dangerous. And it took human ingenuity. It took building liberal institutions. It took human creativity to ensure and harness the printing press for liberal democracy. And I wish that the tech folks just said, look, we've unleashed this new technology. We didn't anticipate all the consequences. No one can. Let's collectively work to harness this technology for the good. And I think people would be much more receptive to that honesty.
There are a lot of conversations that emerge from that, including the psychological makeup of people who have multi-billions of dollars. I have rarely seen, I've known a humble billionaire. I've never known a humble multi-billionaire. These people have, there's too much power in the hands of too few over there. So let me ask you a question about that. The corporate conglomeratization of all media that began, of course, with the Telecommunications Act in 1996. At the time, Michael Powell said that, it'll be okay because we still have the internet. What we're talking about, of course, is that the same corporate conglomeratization has happened on the internet that had happened on mainstream media. Where does the fault lie when we're talking about the refusal of the U.S. government to prosecute antitrust?
I think it's been a collective failure of every administration since 2000 and of the Congress. We should have made sure that those companies weren't allowed to engage in the acquisitions they did. We should have made sure that they didn't have the ability to be dominant platforms and not give small businesses the option of having more choices of who they advertise with. So I think that the fault lies with sort of a naive view that, well, these services are free, so what's the harm? But the harm is that you've had a race to the bottom on these social media platforms, that you have a couple tech billionaires deciding the contours of speech, not courts, not a rich tradition, and that you have small businesses now having two options, Google or Facebook, and who they advertise with. And that's a big challenge for the economy.
Before we move off that topic, though, what about the legitimate aspect of the civil liberties issue here? I do agree in the ban on hate speech online, et cetera, except I also know that there are some people on the right who would see people like you and me as needing to be banned at times. How are we going to do all this? How are we going to protect everybody while we also protect the safety of people?
So I took a contrary position, actually, to many Democrats, even though I thought that the Hunter Biden stuff was complete bogus and a total fabrication on the right. I didn't think that that content should have been banned by Twitter or Facebook. I thought, if you run for president, if you run for Congress, you open yourself up to all types of speech and even speech that's not true. And so where I draw the line is I think speech that's inciting violence, when you're on Parler and you're talking about assassinating the vice president, when you're on Facebook and you're plotting attempts to storm the Capitol, that speech ought to be removed. But if someone is saying things that are untrue about me or about my family, if I'm a public official, that has to be part of the messy public debate.
So that's where the line is for you, and I think that's a reasonable line. Okay, I want to go on to a different topic. You first caught my attention, Congressman, because of your interest and passion around the subject of what has been occurring in Yemen. I remember when Mike Pompeo, the more I read about what was happening in Yemen, the more I read about the arms deal that we were okaying in order, and in exchange for that, we were giving aerial support to the Saudi Arabian war, genocidal war, tens of thousands of people having starved, many of them children. And I remember when I read an article, a reporter had asked Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, how could the United States do something so heinous as to be at least indirectly involved in the prosecution of a genocidal war? He said something that was so chilling to me. He said, sometimes you have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values, which to me, of course, means you have no values, that we have completely had, at least under President Trump, completely sacrificed all moral values in our foreign policy. Can you please give us an update? Where do things stand now with Yemen? What is Biden doing? How quickly will it take? I know you know a lot about this subject, and I'd love to hear you download about Yemen.
Well, thank you, Marianne, for your voice on this, your activism. So few people know about it, but it is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. Literally, tens of thousands of Yemeni civilians have died. Women, children, innocent people are dying, and they're dying in many cases because of starvation. And the situation is going to get potentially worse, with hundreds of thousands subject to famine if we do not reverse the situation. And it's very simple what the United States needs to do. We need to make it clear to the Saudis that we're going to stop giving them any logistical support, any spare parts, any arms support, any intelligence support for their bombing campaign in Yemen, and that we expect them to lift the blockade. They're still inspecting food and medicine going into Yemen, and not enough aid is getting to the people. But if the President Biden makes it clear that we're not going to support the Saudis, I think Griffiths can bring this war to an end in months, and that's what the U.S. policy should be.
Let me ask you, when I was running, I had been very supportive of a bill that originally came from Dennis Kucinich, was the idea of a Department of Peace, that now Barbara Lee has introduced the Department of Peace Building. Is that something you're a co-signator on, and would you be, and do you know enough about it, and what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a wonderful idea. And Barbara Lee is now a lead for it. And all it's saying is that we ought to be engaged in diplomacy and peace building. One of the great honors of my life, I actually went down with Barbara Lee, and we went to see President Jimmy Carter, and he gives a sermon at his local church in Plains, Georgia. And President Carter, I still remember, he said, what does it mean to be a superpower? And he asked people in the pews what they thought, and someone said having a strong economy, and someone said having a strong military. And President Carter said, let me tell you what I think it means to be a superpower. Wouldn't it be an amazing feat if people looked to Washington to be a beacon for peace, and some place which had wisdom to bring people together and to help resolve disputes and to help be generous in leading a more just world? That's what it really means to be a superpower. He said it much more eloquently than I'm paraphrasing him. But that's what a Department of Peace is. It's about living up to our highest values of recognizing the dignity, not just of all Americans, but all human beings.
Well, I think, one of the most powerful moments in the inauguration for me was when the Catholic priest said, America confesses. That was very profound on a spiritual level. A lot of light burst forth, because everything that you just described as the description, Jimmy Carter's description of what the United States should be as a superpower, is so not what we are. The people of the world, you could almost, when you were just saying that, Congressman, you could almost hear the guffaw. You could almost hear the guffaw from people who I know are going to be listening to this podcast. You could almost hear the guffaw from people around the world, That right there is a crisis in how we are perceived, because I think until the last few decades, the world did see us never having gotten it perfect, but they would give us credit for trying. And now the hypocrisy is so obvious when we even say those things. How are we going to have a deeper level? I disagree that it's as simple as having a Department of Peace, because, well, what you just said was that a Department of Peace would be a greater concentration on diplomacy, et cetera. Well, for that, theoretically, we have the State Department. But when you have a $760 billion budget for the Defense Department and a $40 billion for the State Department, and when you see so much, and this was true, Congressman, in under Democratic administrations as well as Republicans, how much of our foreign policy nexus of power has been shifted from the diplomat to the military. And the Democrats aren't seen, and they're not seen because they're not any more of a challenge to the military-industrial complex than the Republicans are. Until we deal with that, Congressman, we can talk peace and what a superpower should be all day long, but we won't be. And this is a crisis for the world.
Well, let me respond to that. You're absolutely right about the military budget. I mean, I sit on the House Armed Services Committee. It's a $740 billion military budget, more than the next 8 countries combined. Obama left it at $600 billion. It's gone up since then. $120 billion is in a slush fund, what Mulvaney called the slush fund, the Overseas Contingency Fund for foreign wars. But here's the biggest point, which I think may put this in context. We spend $100 million on at the NIH on anti-vaccine diagnostics, and we spend $100 million on vaccine therapies. Imagine if we had just spent 10 more times that, and what that would have meant for our national security with COVID. That would be $1 billion. Now think that we're spending on aircraft carriers and ships 700 times that for defense. So it's not just a moral issue. It's an issue of misplaced priorities, of things that aren't actually keeping the country safe with the average American. The final thing I would just say is we're all a product of our upbringing and our own histories and our own stories. And I guess what inspires my hope for this country is my grandfather spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi in the 1940s, and it was America in World War II that said to the British, no, you need to decolonize. It was America that stood up for decolonization at that point. And so I see now in America that, yes, it had Donald Trump, but I see in America that has people from literally every part of the world with every story of struggles of freedom in every part of the world. And the hope for a multiracial, multi-ethnic America emerging more consistent with our principles and the application of those principles overseas, I think is very possible. And that's certainly the foreign policy that I'm working towards.
And of course, what people realize is that the budget of the Defense Department doesn't even reflect what the Pentagon has asked for. It reflects billions of dollars above that are just short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. And we certainly look forward, many of us, to when the Democrats as well as the Republicans are going to be willing to call that out and to do something about it. When you talk about how the world perceives us and how we were in the past, I love that President Biden has put FDR's picture over the mantle in the Oval Office, because that makes me happy that he's looking at FDR every day. FDR is famous for having said this country needs to become fairly radical for a generation, because the country had entered into a period of such economic devastation for so many people. And I think it's important we remember that those conditions that were present among people in the Great Depression were no worse than what is being experienced right now by tens of millions of people. And Bernie, of course, adopted Roosevelt's phrase, the economic royalists. And when the economic royalists called Franklin Roosevelt socialist, they said he was an enemy of capitalism. He said, I welcome their hatred. So I hope that you will support President Biden in being willing to be hated, being willing to be opposed. Sometimes we have to remember that our unity with the American people who need our help is more important than our unity with people who have no desire to help them.
Marianne, I agree with that because it's one thing to be a president who seeks the unity of the American people, and I think that is a worthy goal. But we don't have a pristine democracy, let alone a strongly functioning democracy. So when you're seeking unity on Capitol Hill, you're seeking unity with lobbyists, you're seeking unity with interest groups, you're seeking unity with a lot of actors who have nothing to do with the American people. So my hope for President Biden is if he wants to seek unity for what people want, I think he'll find that a lot of that is consistent with progressive policy.
Before I let you go, I want to end on that topic of what it's like to be a real progressive in Congress today. There's a real split here, Congressman, and the whole country's watching. We can see it. There's a big split in the Republican Party, but there's a big split in the Democratic Party, too. You've got your corporatists, you've got your neoliberal corporatists, and then you've got your progressives. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said at one point, that there are other countries where she and Joe Biden wouldn't even be in the same party. Are you hopeful that progressive voices such as your own, which represent, if you look at all of the progressive candidates and all of the progressive people, represent a large block of the American people. If you look at the polls and you look at something like Medicare for all, $2,000 a month, cancellation of the college loan debt, free college and university, if you look at issue after issue, the American people are left of center. The American people, when you ask them about issues, are with the progressives. And yet, not only in 2 presidential races, but also in how things have worked out even during the presidential campaign, we have seen progressives routinely sidelined and peripheralized. What's going to happen now? How are you going to make sure that voices such as yours are not only given a listen, but given the power that the numbers of Americans who support your ideas mean that you deserve?
I think we can take hope, Marianne, from the 2020 election. We should not forget that there was a time where many people thought Elizabeth Warren would be the nominee. There was a time, I know, that many people thought that Bernie Sanders would be the nominee. There were times that your clips on reparations and racial equity went viral when millions of people responded to that. So the politics has changed dramatically in this country, both in terms of the diversity of the field, but also the diversity of the ideas than when I was growing up, or then even 10 years ago. And, ultimately politics is a winner takes all sport. And so one person won and Biden won. But that doesn't mean we forget how much representation, how many votes progressives actually got. And Bernie Sanders in 2020 was much, much closer than Bernie Sanders of 2016. I mean, people actually thought he was going to be the nominee. So I have no doubt in my mind that whether it's 24 or 28 or 32, we're going to have a progressive win in this country, and they're going to win with a House and a Senate that's progressive. My concern, so that's what gives me hope, that's what gives me confidence in the progressive movement and the ascendancy of progressives in the Democratic Party. That's not my concern. My concern is how many people are going to suffer in the meantime. I mean, 2032 may be fine for those in Congress in terms of saying, okay, we're going to get in 10 years, we're going to get progressive policy. But what does that mean to someone who doesn't have health care, who is going bankrupt, who doesn't have enough to pay for their kids' education? There's deep suffering, deep structural damage, and there's deep damage to our country in terms of being competitive as China is building factories of steel and clean steel and solar plants. What are we doing to reindustrialize? So the urgency is not because I lack confidence of the progressive movement. It's because I fear what the road the country is going down until progressive ideas start to be implemented.
I appreciate your sense of urgency, and I appreciate your passion about ending the suffering of so many people, not later, but sooner. And I don't want to come across cynical, but you know and I know, because we were both there. Bernie didn't get a chance on Super Tuesday, did he? I think it would be very disingenuous of either of us to underestimate what we know to be true, which is the institutional resistance within the highest regions of the DNC, et cetera, to allow the kind of progressive power and certainly in a presidential candidate, but even on the other levels as well, to come forward. And I think that our putting that on the table, which might not be as easy for you to do because you're in, maybe easier for me to do because I'm outside, but I believe that until that's faced, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we have to face how much institutional resistance there is within the Democratic Party to letting the progressive forces have their say. I think the fact that... I'm sorry, go on.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, obviously, that was a coordinated effort to have people drop out and all endorse Biden. And, I still remember, I don't often go to Nate Silver's site, but I had gone and it was like 65% chance Bernie's going to win the nomination. And 2 days later, it became 70% Biden's going to win. So there was a concerted effort to stop Bernie. And all of the pundits on cable news were Bernie is risky, and they focused on his comments on Cuba, which were 1% of the campaign, as opposed to on Medicare for all and free college, what he was really running on. So I don't doubt that there are institutional hurdles, but are the hurdles as steep as what Dr. King faced, or what Lyndon Johnson faced, or what FDR faced? No. I think the overcoming of institutional hurdles in the modern Democratic Party is a far, far easier hurdle than, let's say, what my grandfather faced with British colonialism. So I do think the young folks in this country will eventually take over the party, but it remains to be seen.
Well, first of all, I think concerted effort is a euphemism, and you know that, but I appreciate it. I appreciate your position. Well, you're a sitting congressman, so I get that. And I believe that some Democrats, even progressive Democrats, might underestimate how much cynicism there is among progressive voters. And that if the Democrats if something doesn't change this time, you could have a split between real progressives and traditional Democrats that could mean calamity for the power of the party.
Yeah. Because I was talking to a reporter Jonathan Martin, actually at the New York Times, who was writing about his thesis is that there are actually four parties, two in the Republican Party and two in the Democratic Party. And how do you think a future progressive candidate avoids that fate? How do you think a future progressive, because at some point, because the policy, it's not even personality. I mean, we could say it's just that the policies of Medicare for all, free public college, these are policies that we need and policies that are popular. And I think this is what frustrates people, is they see policies that make sense, policies that are popular, and then candidates are running on those platforms not succeeding. And that at some point something has to change.
Well, one thing that has to change ultimately, obviously, is the money in politics. The Democratic Party is still so slavishly devoted to its own corporate sponsors that it will do what it can to ameliorate pain on the periphery, but doesn't seem willing to challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable, whether it has to do with health insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, or any others. One of the things that's interesting to me, Congressman, is the Republican voter isn't so deferential to the RNC as the typical Democratic voter is so deferential to the DNC. I don't understand it. The Republican voter says, yeah, they're our office. When the RNC said, well, you can have Ted Cruz, you can have Marco Rubio, or you can have Jeb Bush, the Republicans said, nah, we want Donald Trump. They just didn't really care what the RNC said. But the DNC, I remember early in the campaign, we have to narrow the field. No, they didn't. That's what primaries are for. So the DNC said, the DNC is not a governmental institution. It's a private corporation. And how you're going to change it, I don't know. You would know more than I, Congressman, but it's not good. Not good.
I think there's absolutely a need for reform, and I agree with you that things happen that have prevented the popular will. But the one reason I think that there is a Democratic loyalty or more loyalty to the party, there are two reasons. One, I think there is a sense in the Democratic Party that if you work your way up, if you pay your dues, that should mean something, and particularly for the African American experience, where so many of the senior members of Congress finally ascended to committee chairmanships and finally have a piece of power, who could have never run statewide. And I think that sense of solidarity represents one of the best of party building, but it has been misused. It has been taken advantage on for entrenching power and interests. And the question is, how do we have that balance where you do reward?
Well, that's what's so interesting, isn't it? Because in both 2016 and in 2020, that led the party to take this attitude towards people who were not Democratic activists, but wanted to vote for a Democratic candidate like they were unruly children. And we don't know if we want to let you in. It's so odd. It's so self-defeating. The Democrats have the more egalitarian policies, but almost a more arrogant, elitist relationship to its own constituency. The Republicans are the opposite. They have the elitist policies, but an oddly more egalitarian relationship to its own constituency. Anybody can come in. Unfortunately, that has its downside that's going to be pointed to. But I know from my own run and from just looking at so many people who are supporters of Bernie, it's like, you haven't been a Democratic activist, so we don't know if we're going to let you in. That's how the Democrats act. The Democrats act like you have to audition to be here. I mean, I saw that in every aspect of my campaign. Even who gets to be on the debate stage had to be enough voters who had already voted in Democratic primaries. Where's the democracy in that? So the entrenched power that you just talked about, I would argue that it's elitist, it's undemocratic, and unworthy of the Democratic Party.
Well, I certainly think we have to open things up. I agree with that, and I agree that you want to be encouraging new voices and encouraging primary challenges and encouraging competition, and to that extent, I agree with you on reform.
Well, Matt Taibbi says that he talks about a gang of 500 political operatives, and he said that after every presidential election, that the elite among the parties basically decide who they're going to run 4 years from now. And you can, once you've been around this enough, you can see it. You can see it. I can see it. You can see who they've basically already chosen for the next wave. Well, the more we put on the table, the more we put it out there, the more people can laugh and know it ain't going to happen. Then I bet on the Americans who every single time throughout our history have ultimately, Churchill is supposed to have said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. We do tend to get on track, even though sometimes it takes us a while to get there. I see you as one of the main voices helping to steer the ship back to its right course. I think the world of you. I really appreciate your coming on the podcast. I appreciate the dialogue that you allowed to happen here. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, things you want us to know or look at or look up? Over to you.
Well, Marianne, my admiration is very much for you as well. The feeling is mutual, but I am so appreciative to all your listeners. And I know it sometimes feels like your voice isn't being heard, that you may be tweeting and it's going and who's paying attention. Let me tell you, we do pay attention. We are hearing you. It matters. Your activism matters. The louder you are, the stronger you are, the more we have an influence in this building. And you're not always going to agree. And I know there was a lot of disappointment in certain cases with Medicare for All early on. We're not always going to agree. But you should know, at least in my case, my respect for what you're doing and my belief that nothing is going to be possible if we don't have that active movement. On Yemen, that's what made the difference. It wasn't me going to members of Congress. It was the movement of people going to members of Congress saying, you need to do something. That's what's made the difference since I've been here in 4 years of my time in Congress. And I just want to thank your listeners for what they're doing.
Well, thank you, Congressman, because we look to people such as yourself to know what it is that we should be doing. And I have always felt great kindness and respect coming from you, which I deeply appreciate. I wish you the best. If you're ever thinking of running for senator from California, you've got a supporter in me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you very much. Great.
Well, that was my conversation with Congressman Ro Khanna. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I do. I appreciated that he showed up for the deeper conversations, and that matters. So often politicians sort of deflect and distract and don't want to really get down and get real and get in the weeds. But I'm sure that you agree with me that Congressman Khanna was willing to do that. Much appreciated. Now it's time for Ask Marianne. And the question I'm taking today is from a young woman named Caitlin. Dear Marianne, I'm a 25-year-old public policy student at a state university, and I want to start off by telling you thank you for continuing to preach that there is a collective need to understand American history better. I had only heard of you and your work when you ran for president, and after exploring your work and reading your book, A Politics of Love, I took it upon myself to begin learning more in depth about the history of America. I wanted to mention this because anyone who's listening to your podcast that still has not taken the time to explore our history, I'm here to tell you it's a must. And this is coming from a 25-year-old who has never been interested in history. Next, I want to ask you about a concept presented in one of my textbooks for a class. Quote, a decentralized Congress and its members are more concerned with its relationships with interest groups, key bureaucracies, and citizen clients. It is difficult to make big policies that require substantial legislative action, particularly since members' clients are often as likely to resist change as they are to support it. The moment I read this, I felt chilled to the bone. This is what they are teaching policy students. My question to you is, am I crazy for thinking this is wrong? I understand that unfortunately this is how our current Congress works, but it is not how Congress should work, right? The textbook does not ever explicitly say that this isn't how the system should work, and I find that troubling. If we're trying to make long-lasting systemic changes, teaching students that this is the new norm feels counterproductive and insulting to all the people who have fought and spoken out to inspire change. I admire you and your work so much, and I strive to bring your ideologies into my future career in legislation. Thank you so much for reintroducing the concept of love into politics. I know that a major shift is coming, and it is the wave makers like you who have rocked the boat of disillusion and disempowerment that America is currently sailing on. I love you, Caitlin. You are absolutely right. I feel this with young people so often who don't have a historical memory of a time when it was not like this. You're right. So they're teaching people basically that corruption is, rather than, and we got a problem, which is the corruption is. The idea that highly paid corporate lobbyists who are able to visit our lawmakers' offices all day, every day, and are able to wield so much undue influence because our lawmakers know that because of the Citizens United decision, more than anything else, the Supreme Court has given corporations unlimited power to affect legislation, means that in too many cases, our lawmakers are more likely to be listening to what the corporate lobbyist says that they want than they are to listen to the constituents and what the constituents say that they want. That is why the money in politics is the cancer underlying all the other cancers. Because the corporate lobbyist doesn't have to say it, and they wouldn't say it explicitly. But what the lawmaker understands is that if you don't go along, we have a lot of money that we can spend to influence the campaign in the direction of your primary challenger or in the direction of your opponent. It doesn't even need to be said. So I am so glad, Caitlin, that you get that the way it's talked about in the textbook is almost as though, well, this is the new norm, as opposed to this is an aberration that absolutely must be fixed. I so appreciate your letter because I appreciate your talking about the importance of history. I also wrote a book called Healing the Soul of America that you might be interested in. I wrote that one before The Politics of Love. And for those of you who have not read either of those books, or for those of you who are not familiar with American history the way you might be, we have states in this country who don't even require half a year of American history, civics, government, and I think that that's a large underlying problem in this country. Too many Americans don't even know the principles on which we purport to stand. Too many Americans don't even know the basic ways that our government works. I have to tell you, when I was watching the footage of the riot at the Capitol, I had a feeling that I'm sure a lot of people had, looking at those people thinking, they don't even know where they are. They clearly don't know what this building is. They don't know where they are. And that's a problem. And a lot of what happened over the last 4 years would not have happened had there not been, on the part of too many people, deep, deep ignorance about how our government is supposed to work. If you don't know how democracy is supposed to work, you don't know to be appalled when its pillars are under attack. If you haven't learned as a child what the Bill of Rights is, you don't know to be horrified as an adult when the Bill of Rights is under attack, when it's being sabotaged or undermined. In terms of my books that Caitlin was just mentioning about the importance of history, when you learn about the founding of this country, when you learn about the dichotomy that was inherent to our founding, when the dichotomy between the fact that on the one hand, we established core principles in the founding of this country that were the most enlightened of any country ever before, but that at the same time, 41 of the 56 signers were themselves slave owners. And you can't get more of a transgression against those principles than ownership of a slave. That struggle, that bipolar nature of American character has always been with us, and every generation plays it out. So what I talk about in my book, Politics of Love, as well as Healing the Soul of America, is how this played out with abolition, which was our response to slavery, how it played out with the women's suffragette movement, which was our response to institutionalized oppression of women, how it played out with the civil rights movement, which was our response to segregation, and how it's going to play out now, because all of us are going to make sure that we, in our time, push back against undemocratic forces that would undermine the embodiment of the ideals on which we purport to stand. I'm so happy, Caitlin, that you caught that. You are absolutely right. Don't normalize the fact that we have become a corrupt society. Point it out. Keep that rambunctiousness alive in your generation. You're 25 years old, and that's exactly what I want to see. I want to see 25-year-olds who go, this isn't right. We've got to make it better. Thanks so much for writing. And remember, if you want to ask me a question, you can write to me at Marianne@castmedia.com. Thank you so much for being with me. Thank you so much to Congressman Khanna for a conversation that I do believe matters. I want to thank all of the people at Cast Media. Thank you to Lauren Selsky, Wendy Zoller, Amanda Elliott, Kaylon Rushing, and everybody at Cast Media. I hope you have a great week or a great time until we meet again. In the meantime, I wish you the very, very best. God bless you. Thanks.